Good evening, all. Tonight we are discussing Aristotle and his Nicomachean Ethics. So let's jump right into it. His summative quotation that appears on the first slide is, "The good of a human being is an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue, and if there are several virtues, in conformity with the best and the most complete." So hopefully you found some differences in reading Aristotle as compared to Plato and Socrates. Aristotle, unlike Plato, does not have time or patience to tell us stories. Rather, he wants to get straight to the point. Okay, so this is a very straightforward writing by Aristotle. That said, it kind of reads like stereo instructions. It's just not the most interesting or exciting writing that Aristotle has to offer. So I will recommend to you that you seek out and read a copy of Aristotle's Politics and Poetics, ideally the edition by the Heritage Press, because he writes really, really well. This just isn't indicative of it. And if you say, well, I don't really like politics or poetics, it's not about those things, strictly speaking. It's about what they were in Aristotle's day. So check that out. These more likely were probably lecture notes. And we have them only in fragments. And so if it seems like he just kind of drops off an idea, it's because he quite literally does. Now, the Aristotle that we're reading is the translation by Martin Ostwald. So this one is not my own translation in this instance, but it is directly from the Attic Greek. And it's really a pretty good word-for-word translation where Aristotle left gaps, Ostwald likewise leaves gaps. So our first key concept for this is that idea of the good. And remember, for the classical writers, and by classical we mean the Greco-Roman writers, so the Greeks and the Romans working on this, the good is what we desire for its own sake, that which does or ought to serve as the aim of all of our actions and choices, remembering that this philosophy is teleological. So end, aim, plan, goal, design, outcome is shooting for that. Now, Aristotle says that the good is happiness, and the word that he uses is eudaimonia, which we usually translate as happiness, but can actually mean quite a few different things. It means something like happiness, completion, perfection, fulfillment, satisfaction. Flourishing is a typically used translation for eudaimonia. But he defines this as an activity of the soul, and of course we know that when he uses soul, he really means mind, in accordance with excellence or virtue. That is, activity guided by and that exercises, that is, expresses the human virtues. Now, the key concept of virtue, a virtue of character, is a characteristic that enables a person to perform the human function well. So recall with Plato, we had the virtue, for instance, of a hammer, the so-called hammerness of the hammer. In this case, to be good at a characteristically human activity. So we're no longer interested in an object or a trait. We want something that is very specific here. And so Aristotle is going to define the virtues as dispositions in accordance with reason. So when we say disposed in this context, we don't mean like thrown away. We mean we're positively disposed or negatively disposed. That is, the glass is half empty, the glass is half full. We have a sunny or a gloomy disposition. And meteorological allegories notwithstanding, that just means how we view things. So when we jump into book one, Aristotle is trying to define the subject matter and justify the method that he's chosen. And that's what he's going to use in chapters 3, 4, 6, and 7 that we also look at. And so as part of this, he considers opinions that are common among people and also the opinions of poets and philosophers. Now, if you read a lot of poetry, you may be given over to the thought that poetry is much more emotional in this presentation, and it typically is. If we read Longfellow or Burns or especially Shelley or Yeats, we're going to get a lot of that emotion in there. On the other hand, we have the philosophers who recall in Plato and Aristotle's time thought that we should only be rational and reasonable all the time. And in the middle, there's the common opinions, somewhere where the rest of us probably fit. So the mainstream of discussion really doesn't start until chapter 1. And this is where he's going to make an assertion, and kind of a bold one, that all making, investigating, all deliberate actions and choice, all aim at some particular good. Now, when he's saying making, keep in mind that Spanish developed from Latin, which itself developed from Greek. So if you're familiar with Spanish or you're a Spanish speaker, he means make in the sense of hacer, to make or to do in this particular context. So basically what he's saying is every single thing that we do, every single thing that we decide, all aims at some very specific good. And he says, A lot of the aims are really only intermediary aims, and we desire them just because they make higher aims possible. So maybe we desire a good grade in this class, but really that's just an intermediary grade aim, because we want the grade to get the degree, to get the job, to get the money, to get whatever it is that we're going to do with the money, okay? But the good for Aristotle is that at which all things aim. And he means that very inclusively. So all the things that could possibly be considered here. In some cases, the activity is the end. In other cases, it's some product beyond the activity. Now, forgive me for being crude, but this is the best way I've thought to explain it. This is sex for recreation versus sex for procreation. In recreation, well, you're just having a good time. In procreation, you're making a baby. And so Aristotle wants us to take this to the furthest logical conclusion we possibly can and see this as complete as it could be. Now, he tells us if there's an end in the realm of action that we desire for its own sake, something that determines all our other desires. So think of your ultimate most goal. Maybe it's to become financially independent. Maybe it's to become rich and famous. Maybe it's to slink into obscurity. Whatever it happens to be, you don't make all of your choices for the sake of something else. Some things you choose just because they are what you desire. Whatever that is, and that will be the good, the highest good. So he says the most honored capacities, things like strategy, household management, oratory, are actually contained in politics. And we go, ew, politics, yuck, I don't like politics. Or maybe we really dig politics, but it's completely different from how we view this. Politics in Aristotle's day was a lot more direct. So if you were a free landowning male, sorry others, in the polis, well, then you were involved in politics. It was part of your duty, in fact, as an Athenian, to be involved in the polis. And he would tell us that the end of politics is the good of man, to include everybody now. But things like strategy, just think, those of you that are in a committed long-term relationship, you need these things in that relationship. Strategy, you know, my goal is to empty the dishwasher before my wife does, because then I don't have to reload it, because I hate that job worse. Household management. Somebody has got to pay the bills and make sure that everything's taken care of and they're not going to shut the lights off on us. Fortunately, my wife does that because she's better at it than I am. And then oratory. You have to be able to express yourself in an intelligent way. Now, she's a debate coach, so there we kind of meet head to head on that one. But these are all political sorts of things. And Aristotle will go on to say something that's very important. You're going to want to make a little marginal note to yourself on this, that the attainment of the good for one man alone is a source of satisfaction. So if we do good for a single other person, we help them change a tire, or we do good for ourselves, whatever it happens to be, that we're satisfied by that. If we secure it for entire nations and for states, he says is nobler and more divine. Divine, divinity, meaning kind of godlike. So we're going to see that again when we get to Thomas Aquinas, but you might want to jot yourself a little note beside that one. Now, he's going to tell us that precision can't be expected in things just like it can't in manufactured articles. So it used to be that when you would go to factory outlets like Tanger and all of that, that they had factory seconds. That was primarily what they existed there to do. So this shirt is not a factory second, but say this buttonhole was just a little bit shorter than the button it needed to meet. That would be a factory second type thing, where either I could live with it a little wonky or I'd have to move the button down or what have you. So these are types of things that, because it's manufactured, we can only expect precision to such an extent. The problem of the good is kind of a similar thing, because sometimes good things can actually bring about harmful results. So he says we've got to try and find some rough and general ideas where we can find the good. And the phrase he uses is hosepi topolu. It means by and large, for the most part, 9 times out of 10, sort of, kind of, maybe, all of that. And we use these qualifiers in language to give ourselves an out. For that 1 time out of 10 that it doesn't work the way that it's supposed to, or the way that we anticipate it will, we want to cover our butts, so to speak, and have an out. So we are going to try and reach conclusions that are the same order as the subject for discussion. This is what we call a necessary limitation. So if we were to discuss what colors are comprised here, I don't know, I would think of this as kind of a teal and this is sort of a blue, but someone else might come along and say, well, no, that's aquamarine or turquoise, and this is clearly cerulean or azure. Now, how close are we going to get? Probably only about as close as we could possibly agree. But the idea is that we're getting as close as we can within reason. We don't want to try and go too far. Now, depending on your circumstances, you will have different ideas about happiness. If you're starving on a desert island, food that you may not necessarily like might comprise happiness for you. If, for instance, you are out in the cold and you don't have a coat, I can't wait for that to happen, then that might be happiness for you. And he says, we're going to start some things from fundamental principles, and they're different from the arguments that lead up to those fundamental principles. So we got to start with what we know already. Some things are known to us because of empirical knowledge. We see them, taste them, touch them, hear them, smell them, and so on. Other things we simply know by definition. So the example of that would be all triangles are going to have internal 180 degrees. I don't need to measure a whole bunch of them, whether they're isosceles, equilateral, scalene, or what have you, to know that they have that. I just know the definition. So I've got to accept things as facts that are starting points. And if that's sufficiently clear, if it's what we call in philosophy prima facie, meaning on the first face of it, there's really no need to go deeper and ask why it's so. Now you see, this is one of those differences between Aristotle and Plato, because Plato would have wanted to tell us a story and you got these guys in a cave and all that, and allow us to kind of suss out the meaning of the allegory for ourselves. Aristotle has neither the time nor the patience for that. He just wants to tell us, look, here's our starting point. We're only going up from here. So think of the three types of life that you could live. Think of what would make you most happy right now. Through those green curtains in there is my library, and sitting in my library is one of the things that makes me most happy in this world. But it's kind of a slavish life of pleasure. I mean, I dig sitting in there and reading, and that's the way the majority of us probably think of happiness, is doing whatever makes us happy. The political life, that would be like the active life, that's an active life of politics. That aims at honor and higher divinity and knowing and judging things, being active in the polis as the ancient Athenians were. And then finally, the contemplative life, just kind of sitting out, chilling and think about things in a deep way. Now, he's going to put away a couple of arguments. And if it seems like I'm jumping around here, it's because the Nicomachean ethics kind of jumps around. So he says, having virtue but being inactive. So if I were the most generous person any of you will ever know, but the problem is that I'm flat broke, so I can't demonstrate my generosity. That really doesn't count for anything. Aristotle says no one's going to think about that. No one's going to consider it unless they're defending a hypothesis. What about money making? If I said I was going to give you $1 million, I know, but I'm flat broke, on the condition that you can't spend it, you can't invest it, and you can't give it to anyone, would it do you any good? Well, not really, because money is all predicated on spending in something, in some sort of commercial capitalist economy, okay? We also have to understand that the good is going to be something final and different in each art considered separately. So what makes a prima ballerina very good at what she does is going to be different than, say, the international strongmen guys when they're lifting thousands of kilos and all of this sort of thing. It's going to be a different context of good. Maybe in one it's flexibility versus strength, maybe one it's grace versus force, and so on and so forth. If there's one end of everything that we do, that would be the good attainable by action. And this is one of those points to really make note of. Aristotle understands us as being not able to passively experience ethics in any kind of way. It's got to be something that we can do, that we can get for ourselves. If there's only one final end, that's going to be the one that we're after. If there are several, it's going to be the most final or the most perfect of them. And obviously we get into some subjectivism there, deciding what is the most perfect or final. Now, what we pursue as ends in itself is going to be more final as those instrumental ends that we pursue in the pursuit of something else. Whatever we never choose as a means to something else, that's a little more final. So we're looking for these things that are inherently good, inherently final. And he says the description seems to apply to happiness above everything else. We always choose happiness as an end in itself. We don't choose it for the sake of anything. So for instance, he tells us honor and pleasure, intelligence, and all of those various virtues, justice, temperance, prudence, obedience, all that kind of stuff, we choose partly for themselves. We would choose them without any further advantages. So we like being honored, we like feeling pleasure, we like feeling intelligent, we like all those different virtues, But we also choose them partly because it makes us happy to be identified as those things. We don't choose happiness for the sake of honor. We don't choose happiness for the sake of pleasure. And we don't choose any of these things as a means to something else. And that should be very important here. Whatever that final and perfect good is going to be self-sufficient, okay? Something self-sufficient, not just with reference to the self alone, though. We're going to define it as that if we take it by itself, makes life desirable and efficient in nothing. That is to say, both complete and satisfying. Remember all those different translations of eudaimonia: happiness, completion, fulfillment, satisfaction, and flourishing. Happiness is something final and self-sufficient and seems to be the end of all of our actions. Everything that we do, to some extent, we do for the sake of happiness. But we're not going to call it the highest good yet, because there's an active part of the rational element that itself has two parts. It's rational in that it obeys the rules of reason, but it's also rational in that it possesses and conceives of its own rational rules. What we mean here is a life that's determined by the activity of rational thought, as opposed to just having rational thought. Now, theoretically, every single human you encounter has rational thought, or at least the capacity for it. But when you find yourself on I-35 during rush hour, it doesn't seem like many of them are exercising their rational thought. And that's kind of the difference that he means here. So he tells us it's not enough just to have it, and also that activity has a greater claim to be the function of humankind than passivity. That is, we're not just here to passively receive experiences, we're here to do stuff. So our proper function is an activity of the soul, and recall when he says soul, he means mind, in conformity with a rational principle, in conformity with something that makes reasonable sense and isn't emotional or passionate. So the proper function of man is a certain kind of life, which is an activity of the soul, meaning mind, and consists in actions that are performed in conjunction with our rational element, to the exclusion of passion and emotion. A person of high standards, then, performs those actions well in accordance with the excellence, the arete, the virtue appropriate to it. So, premise, here's the conclusion. The good of man is an activity of the soul, meaning mind, in conformity with virtue, and if there are several virtues, in conformity with the best and the most complete in a complete life. Completion, perfection, fulfillment, satisfaction, flourishing, eudaimonia. Now, to that end, we really shouldn't expect a causal explanation in all inquiries. That is to say, when we're dealing with fundamental principles, with the bare basics, it's sufficient to point out convincingly that such and such is the case. Okay, we know the primary thing, the fundamental principle, and we know different things in different ways. Some things we know by induction, that is inductive reasoning. Based on our own experience, all of the swans I've ever seen are either white or black, therefore all swans must be white or black, and indeed they are. Some things we know by sense perception. Those wooden pillars behind me are really hard, and if you walk into them in the middle of the night and stub your toe, it hurts. Some things we know by habituation. When I leave the house, I grab my wallet, which is in a drawer over there. I grab my keys, which are on a hook over there, and I leave the house. And so I've got everything. When I come back in, I put the stuff away in the same place, so I know where it is. Others by other means. And there's a whole bunch of different ways that we learn things. We've got to attempt to know the facts, says Aristotle, in the way naturally appropriate to them, and then be very careful, be scrupulous, he says, in defining it carefully and with clarity. To this end, all things that are good are going to fall into three distinct categories, and these are not the same as Plato's categories of the good, so make sure you make yourself a little note and carefully demarcate these. There are external goods, which are exactly what they sound like. This house, my shirt, my car, those are all external goods. There are goods of the soul, and of course he means goods of the mind. These are our soul's actions, our activities, our appreciation for literature or music or what have you. And then finally, there are goods of the body. Good rest, good exercise, good sex, good food, whatever you like, okay? Now, we're defining the end as consisting of actions and activities. And he tells us that the final end is included among goods of the soul and not among external goods. Why? Well, I mean, this house, God forbid, could burn down. My car could be stolen. My shirt could be ruined at the cleaners, whatever. Goods of the body, I mean, I'm not in the greatest shape to begin with, but my body can break down over time. I can get sick, I can die, and so on. Goods of the mind, though, are the most persistent ones that we have available to us. So we've got that. Now we've got to figure out what virtue is. Now keep in mind, Aristotle was one of the world's first biologists, first taxonomists. So he wants to categorize things very, very carefully. And so he tells us, could it be a characteristic? Well, no, because I could have a characteristic, maybe I smile a lot, without ever producing any good or noticeable result. It's not benefiting anybody. An activity, though, always produces a result. Even if it's a negligible one, an unimportant one, it's still coming around in something. Now, he'll tell us that actions performed in conformity with virtue are pleasant and virtuous. That is, if you do good things and you're a good person, it probably feels good to do those things. Sorry about that. If you don't enjoy performing noble actions, you're probably not a good person. Yeah. So, how are we going to get this happiness stuff? Think about the last time you found money. You were walking along and there on the sidewalk, there was 20 bucks, maybe 5 bucks, maybe just a penny. But I'm willing to bet with reasonable certainty, and you can tell me in the comments if this is incorrect, that every single one of you watching this video has found money at some point in your life. Maybe a great amount, maybe a small amount, maybe you gave it back, maybe there was no money to give it back to, and so you kept it and spent it, whatever. If happiness depends on arete, that is, if happiness depends on virtue, excellence, it's going to be accessible by all rational people. So if I'm not one of those 4 groups that really can't have control of my rational thought, it's available to me. You know, we're not all going to be generous or courageous or what have you, but we could be, okay? How am I going to get it? Study and effort are going to make it accessible to me if my capacity for virtue is unimpaired. That is, provided I'm not the very young, the very old, the completely insane, or the profoundly mentally handicapped, then I've probably got a chance at it. If it's better that happiness be acquired that way than by chance, it's reasonable to assume that's the way it's acquired. So back to the finding money idea, you know, we've all found money, 100% success rate there, but it probably wouldn't be a wise basis on which to plan our retirement. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to find money and it'll take care of itself. That just doesn't seem very likely. So, what are we going to find about this? He gets into some psychological foundation. It says the soul, and keep in mind he means the mind here, behaves just like the paralyzed limbs of the body. If the body is irregular, you know, some people are taller, some people are shorter, some are fatter, some are thinner, some are balder, some have big hair, you know, that of the soul is not. You can see this from across the street. If I've got a disposition of my mind, though, you really can't tell that. Okay? There's something, though, inside the mind, besides the rational element, that opposes it and reacts against it. Now, even if the mind accepts the leadership of reason, there's still those other things in there, the emotional and the passionate. Virtues are going to be divided up just like the mind is. Some are intellectual, some are moral. So he tells us there's some useful things that we can accept that, that Plato said, like the division of the soul into rational and irrational parts. And the further division of the irrational parts, one is not human, he calls it vegetative. Okay, and at most it's work during sleep. This is where our virtue is least obvious. This is where we experience the passions. The second irrational part, this is the appetitive. This is the emotion. We're going to break our virtues into 2 groups also, into intellectual and the characters, the virtues of character. These are ethical or moral virtues. These pertain to the irrational part of the mind as well. What's this going to look like? Well, he'll tell us in book 2 that virtues of character are best described as means, okay? And whereas virtues of thinking, these are intellectual virtues, require sound teaching, experience, and time. For instance, you could learn to rebuild an engine. You could learn to carry out long division. Those just require a good teacher, some practice, and time to do it. Virtues of character, these are your moral virtues. These come from the consequence of following the right habits. And he says you've got the potential by nature, but whether it comes to be present isn't determined by nature. That is to say, any of us could potentially be generous, but we won't all necessarily be generous. Now the question becomes one of, how do we get these virtues? And he tells us they're not implanted in us by nature, but they're also not contrary to our nature. We're equipped by nature with the ability to receive them, and habit's going to bring that ability to completion and fulfillment. First, we've got the capacity, then we display the activity. So think of your senses, okay? First, you possess them, that is, you're born and you've got eyes and ears and a nose and a mouth and so on, and then you use them. You open up your eyes for the first time, you see stuff. You hear stuff for the first time, you taste stuff for the first time, and so on and so forth. Virtues you don't have, Aristotle says, and I'm inclined to agree, until you put them into use. That is, you're not generous, really, until you perform a generous action. So, what is that going to look like for us? We have to be careful because the same things that produce virtue can also destroy it or can produce vice. If you develop the habit of acting virtuously, after a while you become virtuous. So you need to make sure that your activities are of a certain kind, since the variations in this are going to be reflected in your character. We've also got to be careful about the activities that we instruct our kids on, because it can make all the difference. So not quite as strictly developmental as Plato was, but he still says, you know, don't be the parent letting your kid run wild in HEB, knocking stuff off the shelves. Now he tells us, we're not studying virtue to attain theoretical knowledge. Well, you and I, we actually are. We're not inquiring to know what virtue is. We are. He says, we're inquiring to become good. So consider that question I posed to you at the end of last week of, is what you're reading here sufficient to make yourself good? That is, could you follow this and be ethical? And so he tells us we've got to look at the problem of actions also. And he gets into a little circular argumentation here that we're going to kind of pick apart. He tells us virtues are destroyed by the excess, too much, and deficiency, too little, and preserved by the mean. Think of it as a balance point. By abstaining from pleasures, let's call that AP, we become self-controlled. Let's call that SC. Once we're self-controlled, we're best able to abstain from pleasures. So we're kind of going in a circle there. By becoming habituated to despise and endure terrors, let's call that DET, we become courageous. Once we become courageous, we'll be best able to endure terror. Again, circular. In logic, we call this post hoc ergo propter hoc. That is to say, after the fact, therefore because of the fact. And it's a fallacious kind of argument, and it becomes really problematic, but we're going to let him go with this one. So he tells us something that, again, we're going to see with a lot of folks kind of down the line, that moral excellence, is concerned with pleasure and pain. Pleasures make us do base actions, think carnal things, and pain prevents us from doing noble actions. Since virtues have to do with actions and emotions, and pleasure and pain are consequences of every action and emotion, virtue has got to have something to do with pleasure and pain. And here he's presaging guys like Hume and Bentham and Mill and a number of others. Virtue makes us act in the best ways involving pleasure and pain, and vice is going to go do the opposite. Here's the problem, though. We love pleasure. A love of pleasure has been ingrained in us since we were babies. You know, babies like to be comforted, they like to be fed, they like to be snuggled up, and all that kind of stuff. As we grow, we don't dislike pleasures anymore. We just get more and better pleasures. So it's harder to fight against pleasure than it is to say things like anger. If we have a right attitude towards pleasure and pain, we'll be good. If we have a wrong attitude towards them, we'll be bad. It's pretty straightforward. So in a lot of this case, it takes choosing the noble and avoiding the base, choosing the beneficial, avoiding the harmful, choosing the pleasurable, avoiding the painful. But wait, sometimes to be ethical, we have to choose the painful and avoid the pleasurable. So this is going to take a little bit of work on our part, says Aristotle. Now, what makes these actions virtuous? It's not enough that they be performed justly or with self-control, but I've got to have certain characteristics as I'm doing this. I've got to consciously know what I'm doing. So if someone's outside my door waiting to get in and I open the door intending for myself to go out and they come in thinking I opened it for them, well, that's not really virtuous. I should make them go back. Wasn't about them. I've got to choose to act the way that I do. And I've got to choose it for its own sake. That is, I have to open the door wanting to help them out and let them in. And the act has to come from a firm and unchangeable character that's been habituated to acting this way. That is, I can't just do it when it's my boss or my wife or someone else. I've got to do it all the time. If people are in need, I've got to help them out. So he tells us acts are virtuous when they're the kind of virtuous man would perform. But the virtuous man is not he who performs these acts, but he who performs them in the way virtuous men do. And again, not really helpful, Aristotle, but let's see where we can go with it. So now he's going to attempt to define these things. He says, look, the virtues and the vices can't be emotions because we're not good or bad on the basis of our emotions, but on the basis of our virtues and vices. We're not praised or blamed for our emotions, okay? Choice isn't usually involved in our emotions. We usually don't wake up going, I am going to hate someone today, okay? We're moved with our emotions, and motion and emotion have important roots that are connected, as we'll see when we get to Thomas Hobbes in a couple of weeks. But with regard to our virtues and vices, we're disposed in a certain way. Remember, sunny disposition, gloomy disposition. So they're not emotions. They're not capacities either, because we're not called good or bad or praised or blamed for being capable. I'm capable of doing awful things. I'm not inclined to do any of them, but I'm capable of them. Capacities have been given to us by nature, but nature doesn't develop us into good or bad people. So he tells us if the virtues aren't emotions and they're not capacities, the only thing left is that they must be characteristics. Now, granted, could we dig this apart? Could we argue? Could we do some intensive Googling and find other things that it could be alternately? Yeah, but this is where he's taking it, so let's go along for the ride. Now, in continuing to define virtue, he gets to what he calls the differentia. So we just did the genus. We would ordinarily today call this the species level thinking. He calls it the differentia. What differentiates things on this level? It's not enough just to call it a characteristic. We got to figure out what kind of characteristic it is. So he tells us every virtue or excellence makes good the thing of which itself is the excellence. So that's kind of the hammerness of the hammer thing. And it makes it perform its characteristic function well. So the virtue of man is going to be a characteristic that makes us a good man and what causes us to perform our characteristic function well. Now, visualize this as a seesaw, as a teeter-totter. Remember those on the playground? They kind of go up and down and they've got that pivot point there. The equal part is going to be something median between excess and deficiency, between too much and too little, okay? The median of an entity, for instance, is a point equidistance from both extremes. It's also called an arithmetic mean. So if we had a number line going between 2 and 10, the median is going to be 6. Doesn't matter who taught you math, where you learned math, how you're displaying it visually, it's always going to be that because it's simple arithmetic to determine it. We're interested in the median relative to us, neither too large nor too small and not the same for everybody. So think of this as Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's just right. If Bill Gates and I are walking down the street together, I don't know why we would, but suspend disbelief, and I give the homeless guy 20 bucks and he gives the homeless guy 20 bucks, what makes me relatively generous and him kind of a cheapskate in this instance? Well, he made more in the time it took me to relay that anecdote to you just now than I will in my entire career. Oh God, why didn't I study computers? But anyway, the median relative to us cannot be determined arithmetically. So we want to avoid excess and deficiency. We want to find that median and choose that, not the median of the object, but the median relative to us, okay? That's where we're going to find that virtue. So a couple examples of this. In feelings of fear and confidence, courage is the mean, okay? If we're talking about the excess, there's really no one who exceeds in fearlessness. And some of these virtues and vices simply don't have a name. Someone who exceeds in confidence is reckless. Someone who exceeds in fear and is deficient in confidence is cowardly. If we're talking about pleasures and pains, not all of them, but the mean is self-control and the excess self-indulgence. If we're talking about generosity, giving and taking money, the excess and deficiency are extravagance and stinginess. And these vices work in opposite ways also. An extravagant person exceeds in spending and is deficient in taking. A stingy person exceeds in taking and is deficient in spending. So we know now that there are three kinds of ways that we can be disposed in two subcategories. We can be disposed viciously to the excess or deficiency and virtuously to the mean. Each one is opposed to both the others. The extremes are opposites to the middle as well as to one another, and the middle is opposed to both extremes. The extremes are more opposed to one another than they are to the medium. Why? Simply because they're farther away, okay? And in some cases, it's the deficiency, and others the excess that's more opposed to the mean. So we're moving that balance point on our teeter-totter depending on how heavy either side is. When one of those extremes is closer, more similar to the median, we're not treating it, but rather the other extreme as the opposite. The more we're naturally attracted to something, the more opposed to the mean does the thing appear to be. If you are a chocoholic, you love chocolate, can't have enough chocolate, give me all the chocolate. that is going to be different than if you could kind of take it or leave it. And there are actually some very strange people out there who don't like it at all. Now, I'm kind of a take it or leave it person, but you know, if I'm a chocoholic, I'm going to have to go a little bit towards the opposite side of that than otherwise. Okay? Now, here's what we've established so far. We know that moral virtue is a mean, and in what sense it's a mean. We know that it's a mean between two vices, one marked by excess, one by deficiency. We know that it's a mean in the sense that it aims at the median in our actions and our emotions, and that's why it's a hard task to be good. In every case, it's a hard task to find the median. Good conduct is exceptionally rare, praiseworthy, and noble. So one of the reasons why we have a tough time thinking of people who are archetypes of goodness is, back to our teeter-totter example, it's really tough to balance in the middle of that thing and just chill out there. We're always going to slide kind of to one side or to the other. We're backing over those points as we do. So sometimes it's necessary to incline towards the excess, sometimes toward the deficiency. Think of it as a broken clock will be right twice a day, because we're going back and forth over that virtue point as we hit excess and deficiency, or at least move towards them. If we fast forward to book 10, we're getting pleasure discussed a little more thoroughly. And he starts by questioning some things. He says, some of these philosophers have said that pleasure should be avoided. And we don't really seem to believe that. I mean, we like pleasure. We like pleasure quite a bit, in fact. And so why would we want to avoid it? And he says, people's actions show that's not really what they believe. They don't want to avoid it. So pleasure is a good that's pursued for its own sake, even if it's not the good. Now, as we get a little further in the semester, some philosophers are going to try and argue that pleasure is, in fact, the good, the only good. Back to happiness, he says it lacks nothing and it's self-sufficient. Now, we're looking for those things, recall, that are desirable for their own sake. And if it's valuable and pleasant to a morally good person, it's probably actually valuable and pleasant. So the happy life is going to be regarded as a life lived in conformity with virtue. And it involves study and effort, not just spent amusing ourselves. Now, he tells us something that might sound kind of incongruous to you. Intelligence is the highest possession we have in us. The objects which are of concern of intelligence are the highest object of knowledge, but also the most continuous. We're able to study more continuously than to perform any other kind of action. Now, hold on. When he says study, he doesn't mean study like we think of study of, I've got to cram for my history test tomorrow, and so I have to read this 800 book in the next 3.5 hours. He doesn't mean that. He means something kind of like mental activities. I read voraciously. I'm constantly reading something, usually a couple or three things at once. When I read, I can get lost in just say one more chapter, one more chapter, one more chapter, and before I know it, it's 4 a.m. and I got to be up in an hour, okay? Or if you YouTube binge, and they're sneaky now. They've got that, these videos are recommended for you, and you wind up kind of down the rabbit hole and maybe can't remember how you got there. We can listen to music and do all these other various things continuously. We're able to do stuff that involves our mind for a really long, long time. With our bodies, not so much. Some of you may be runners. I am definitely not a runner. I don't run and hit the wall and run through it. I hit the wall, I crumple at the base of it, and I weep like a small child because my shins hurt. But bodily stuff is limited. Mental stuff, fairly unlimited. So what we've got, it follows that our reasonable, rational conclusion then is the activity of our intelligence is the complete happiness of man, provided we've got it in a complete span of life. So kind of ambiguous as to what that could mean. For nothing connected with happiness can be incomplete. So a life guided by intelligence is the best and the most pleasant for man, inasmuch as intelligence above all is man. Remember, Aristotle, the biologist, says we're animals, but we're the rational animals, and intelligence more than anything else is what really defines us. And so happiness is going to be some kind of study or contemplation, some mental rather than physical activity. If our activity is guided by intelligence, if we cultivate our intelligence and keep it in the best condition, challenging our minds and our brains and stuff, we'll be the most beloved by the gods. And so that is where he leaves us off, and that is where I will lead you off. As always, if you have questions about this, by all means, post them in the comments below or in the discussion, and we will address those as we can. For next week, I'm asking you to read a couple of different things. First, you're going to be reading from Blessed Augustine of Hippo, who has some interesting things to tell us, and he is going to be a continuation of Plato in the Middle Ages. And then we have Thomas Aquinas, who is going to be a continuation of Aristotle in the Middle Ages. So read those both closely and carefully, and we will knock them both out a week from this evening. Thanks, and have a great night. Bye-bye.